at Berkeley. Panelists include several former Defense Department officials. This is a little more than 2 hours.
Welcome, everyone. If people take seats, we can begin. My name is Jack Citron. I'm the director of Institute of Governmental Studies, which, together with the Department of Physics, I think is the first such formal collaboration. We are co-sponsoring this fascinating seminar. This seminar is one of the series that we sponsor under the rubric of the Harold Smith Seminar Series, which focuses on U.S. defense policies with emphasis on the control and management of nuclear weapons. And this is the third year of the series, and we've had numerous distinguished experts come here to speak about vital matters. And the reason that they come is because of the person for whom this series is named, Dr. Harold Smith, who I'm going to invite up here in a minute. And Harold holds the appointment of visiting scholar with the Institute of Governmental Studies, and also, I believe, a distinguished resident scholar at Goldman School of Public Policy. He has a long history at Berkeley. He was professor here and chair of the Department of Nuclear Energy before moving on to work first in the private sector and then within government, where he was the Assistant Secretary in the Department of Defense with responsibilities in this nuclear proliferation area. He has many other honors. I'm just going to mention two. One is Fellow of the American Physical Society, and the second, which I love to announce, is Commander in the Legion of Honor of France. So without further ado, Harold. I should say that we are have the privilege of being recorded by C-SPAN, which is why I wore probably the wrong color tie, but anyway, we are going to be on C-SPAN this whole event.
Friends and colleagues, the text today is from Robert Frost's poem, The Mending Wall. I'm going to quote from it. "Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense." In the poem, Frost was already too late. The wall had been built. It was simply being repaired. And we are too late today to ask these questions about today's wall, namely ballistic missile defense. It already exists. The United States has unilaterally withdrawn from the ABM treaty. Interceptors have been placed in Alaska to defend against North Korea. The Obama administration is negotiating a European missile defense to defend against Iran, which indeed is, quote, like to give offense, end quote, to Russia, and it already has. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, but that's not the subject today. The subject is, where should we go from here? Not how or why did we get here. Among the pressing questions will be, what is the Obama ballistic missile defense approach, and how does it differ from the Bush policy? Is the current U.S. BMD strategy based on sound technical principles? What are the likely international ramifications of the Obama administration's approach to missile defense, particularly in Europe? To address this question, we have three talented and highly qualified experts. To my immediate left is Michael Nacht, professor of public policy at the Goldman School, recently returned from a post in the Obama administration as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Global Security. On my far right, Dean Wilkening, a distinguished member of the staff of the Livermore Laboratory and the former technical director of Stanford's CISAC. Dr. Wilkening has published and spoken widely on BMD. And in the middle is Professor Theodore Postol, Professor of Science, Technology, and National Security at MIT. Ted has also published and spoken widely on this subject. Each will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, hopefully without interruption, unless there's an absolute fit of brilliance that grips one of us, myself included. This will be followed by 30 minutes of clarification among the speakers, where the goal, unlike the recent presidential debates, will be to inform the audience, not to disparage the speaker. Then there will be time for Q&A, questions and answers from the audience, and I will enumerate the ground rules for that at the appropriate time. With that, I turn to Michael Nacht for the first talk. Michael?
Thank you very much, Harold, and delighted again to be back at IGS and to discuss some of these issues. My assignment this afternoon is to give you kind of an overview of the policy approach of the administration to missile defense that led to the publication of the Ballistic Missile Defense Review report in early 2010, why it advocated what it did, and a little bit about what's happened since. And then my colleagues will provide a lot of detail on the technological issues, pros and cons of the systems. I was tempted to spend a little time giving a background about this subject, but Harold basically said don't do that. So just to say that there has always been, there has been a debate for decades about the wisdom of missile defense, putting aside its technical feasibility. In the most simple terms, if you and I both had missiles, offensive missiles, that could destroy each other, and each of us was confident our missiles could get through, even if we were struck first, then we'd have some sort of condition of strategic stability through mutual deterrence. But supposing in that situation, I started to build missile defenses while still retaining my offensive capability, you could plausibly construe that as an offensive measure, thinking that I was building the missile defenses to degrade your retaliatory attack after I struck you first. So in the 60s, the US went through a long period of trying to explain to our Soviet colleagues why we thought missile defense was not stabilizing, was destabilizing. And the Soviets had built a missile defense system around Moscow, and it still is there. Anyway, the ABM treaty ultimately was signed as a culmination of that effort, which limited both the US and Soviet sides to 2 sites. This ultimately went away, as Harold said, 30 years later under the Bush administration. There is a clause, a Supreme National Interest Clause, which permits either side to withdraw after sufficient notice. We did that. We didn't illegally abrogate the treaty. We legally withdrew. But it led to increased tensions with the Russians. And now I'll skip further, there was SDI under Reagan, which was a huge effort that was proven to be technologically infeasible. There was a shift under George H.W. Bush, and then more so under Clinton, where I served as an arms control negotiator on theater missile defense. We could talk more about that if you'd like, what happened and why there wasn't actually a lot of progress with the Russians on that. When President Obama came into office, he requested a review of the entire program. The politics, the policy, the technical capabilities, future plans. And we were also under constraints because the Congress had basically mandated that the administration provide them with a report on our approach within a year. This was actually then the first comprehensive review of all aspects of our programs into a published unclassified open report, and that came out in February 2010. It's on the web, Ballistic Missile Defense Review Report. Anybody can read it. When we came into office, what we inherited was a proposal from the George W. Bush administration to put some interceptors, 10 interceptors, in Poland, and a radar, a sophisticated radar in the Czech Republic, and a sort of other capabilities. And it was basically justified as an attempt to deter, or if necessarily to degrade, an Iranian attack on European targets. But it did provoke the Russians, who saw this as a kind of toe in the water, leading to a capability that could degrade their strategic retaliatory capability. Now, many times under Clinton, under George W. Bush, and under President Obama, senior Americans have met with the Russians, have given detailed PowerPoint presentations and other kinds of discussions to demonstrate, I think very persuasively, that there's no way that these systems could seriously degrade a Russian attack. Not that we want the Russians to attack, but we want the Russians to feel comfortable that their retaliatory capability is not threatened. Remember, if you have 10 interceptors and it works perfectly, if you attack it with 11 missiles, you're going to win. So you can overwhelm the system. You can confuse the system with chaff and decoys of various kinds. You can blind the radars. You can now use cyber against the communication systems. There are many things you can do to try to defeat an ABM system. And you're going to hear quite a bit about that, I think, by my colleagues. The administration decided, after many meetings, consultations, memos, and other activities, and consulting with many experts of a variety of persuasions, to modify the approach. And what was approved by the President was the European Phased Adaptive Approach, EPAA, European Phased Adaptive Approach. And what that entailed was a group of interceptors placed in different places, some of which were yet to be determined, and some radars that were interconnected that could defeat what we saw as a growing missile threat, particularly from Iran, but against other potential threats against European targets. The Poles and the Czechs had never actually approved the Bush plan. Their governments had nominally approved it, but their legislators had never essentially ratified the agreements. So there was nothing actually in concrete that would have made clear that we could have even implemented the Bush plan. But we chose to diversify the portfolio, so to speak, to look at a number of different ways to base these missiles, including at sea, not just on land, and also to do something a little bit like this in Northeast Asia with our Japanese and South Korean colleagues to meet a North Korean threat. Now, I should add that there was not just a military and sort of technical objective involved in this decision. There were other aspects, other dimensions, other motivations to the decision. One was, hopefully, to essentially deter the adversary. We didn't want to use this stuff. We didn't want to just have it there so when the war started we could use it. In fact, we hoped never to use it. The plan was to demonstrate credibly to other militaries that they would pay a high price for launching such an effort, and it was not likely to achieve their military objectives. So deterrence was a key policy motivation. At the same time, there was a motivation of assurance and reassurance of allies. You know, NATO is now 28 members. I remember as a kid it was 12 and 16, now it's 28. And I had the privilege and opportunity to chair the NATO high-level group while I was in government, which is the group that oversees NATO nuclear weapons policy. So I met a number of times in Brussels with representatives of every member of NATO, except the French, who do not participate in the high-level group. So 27 out of the 28. With the French, we met privately, so we basically were meeting with all of them. And as you can imagine, with any group of 28, there's tremendous heterogeneity. Right? If you're in Poland, on the edge of the Russian border, with the history that they've had with Russia, you have one view about the need for some of these systems. If you're in Spain on the beach, you have a different view. And it's not easy to come to a kind of consensus view on what to do. But overall, there was very strong support among the NATO members to go forward with what the U.S. Proposed. They thought it was important to reassure their publics and their government officials that the U.S. is going to be there, especially remember at a time when President Obama is advocating reduction and, in fact, elimination of nuclear weapons. And the nuclear security guarantee has been at the cornerstone of the NATO alliance since 1949. So here, there's, in a way, a third angle in defense policy motivating this, which is this is a non-nuclear dimension to alliance cohesion that's fully consistent with the president's approach to reducing and eliminate nuclear weapons without in any way leading to an unraveling of our alliance with NATO or with the Japanese or Koreans or whatever. And there's also been, although it's not in the form of a treaty, extensive collaboration with Israel on this. Israel has a growing, sophisticated Arrow missile defense system intended to deal with the threats in their neighborhood. And there's a lot of collaboration with the Israelis in terms of technology, radar, interfaces, strategy, intelligence gathering, and so forth. Turkey, which was originally not that interested in supporting this project, ultimately now has agreed. Romania is going to be a base for some interceptors. Poland and the Czech Republic will each play a role. So there's a lot of multilateral support for this among many key U.S. allies. Where we've run into a problem is that, not that these issues are totally resolved, it's an ongoing alliance management issue, but I'd say it seems quite manageable. And also, since a number of the systems will be based at sea in international waters, we don't need anybody's approval there. But where we've run into a problem is with the Russians and also to some extent with China. By all accounts, by everything we seem to know, the senior analysts in the strategic rocket forces of the Russian Federation have persuaded their leadership that what we are proposing, and particularly what we're proposing down the line, because this is called a phased adaptive approach. This is a decade-long program with some new systems coming on board by 2020. You'll probably see a lot of this with my colleagues. And the so-called SM-3 Mod 2, which is a quite advanced interceptor from what we have now. We don't have that now. That the Russians, extrapolating to the capabilities they think we're going to have, believe it will pose a threat to their deterrent. And we have been engaged with them in missile defense cooperation talks led by Undersecretary of State Ellen Tauscher, who used to represent Lawrence and Livermore National Labs here in Contra Costa County, Lawrence, Livermore, and Sandia National Labs in Costa County. She's been negotiating for quite some time, since the spring of 2009 till now, and they haven't reached agreement. And in fact, unfortunately, President Medvedev made a statement not too long ago saying that they have not borne fruit. The Russians are very concerned, and they feel that if there's not an agreement to share more data and in fact share operational capability, the Russians want to be involved in the operation of these weapon systems, which is a bit of a problem for us, that it could lead them to, that the Russians themselves would consider withdrawing from the New START treaty that they just signed with Obama last year. So we have a lot of work to do with Russia. I should have finally add, I think I've already gone on almost as long as I need to, that there's still another dimension to the motivation here, which didn't lead us to withdraw the missiles, the original Bush plan, But there is a Russia improvements aspect to this strategy. Namely, you may know if you follow this that as early as the spring of 2009, President Obama and Vice President Biden have spoken about the Russia reset strategy. When we came in, relations with Russia were very bad. The Russians had invaded Georgia in the summer of '08. The Russians were very upset about the expansion of NATO, which actually happened under the Clinton administration. They were upset with a wide variety of American proposals. They were very upset with the U.S. Withdrawal from the Airborne treaty, whether it was, even if it was legally fine. And part of the Obama approach has been to improve relations with Russia, not just to be a good guy and to get along better, but for very concrete objectives, because on the nuclear side, the American position under Obama is that the proliferation of nuclear weapons to other countries and their use by terrorists, nuclear terrorism, is now in fact the top threat, top security threat to the United States. It's not the threat of a 3,000 reentry vehicle exchange with the Russians or doing this with the Chinese. It's the fact that nuclear weapons will be acquired by other states. The more hands that are on nuclear weapons, the more likelihood that they'll either be used, like in South Asia or the Middle East or East Asia, or that they'll be stolen, obtained in some way by non-government groups, some of whom have, as we saw through 9/11, willingness to die in support of their goals. So the Obama objective has been to bring the Russians and the Chinese more closely aligned with our view that we've got to stop that threat. And in order to do that, we need to have persuasive arguments and tangible measures that we've taken, which would be in their interest. So we wanted very much to do a variety of things so that they would support sanctions against Iran, which we've had trouble getting them to support. In the Chinese case as well, there have been issues with them. More cooperation in a united front against North Korea, which has also been a challenge. But improving relations with Russia has been, at least at the table, in how we sought to deploy propose to deploy the weapon systems and the radar's associated capabilities, and yet we're still struggling with that. It's not resolved. And with China, they're also making a somewhat similar argument that they have a smaller force, although actually their actual force is actually not known. And there's been some very revelatory articles in the Washington Post at the end of last year that projecting that they may have 10 times the number of nuclear weapons that the community thinks it has. Their strategy is not known, their plans are not known, their deployment plans are not known. But the Chinese are also saying that bringing Russia and China with missile defenses, coupled with U.S. nuclear forces, and coupled with conventional prompt global strike capabilities, these will be new long-range missiles with conventional weapons, but super accurate, that could attack point targets like silos and radars and other hard-to-get targets, that this poses a threat to them as well. That's why in the Nuclear Posture Review, we propose both strategic stability talks with both Russia and China to get these issues on the table, have sustained dialogue and discussion with them, present data, have them present counter arguments, and hopefully reach some agreement. If you're a student of this sort of thing, I mean, with Russia, with the Soviet Union going way back to the Cold War, there were pugwash meetings in Nova Scotia with scientists in 1960. The first agreement we really had with the Soviet Union that mattered was 1972. So it took 12 years. So, Obama spoke about strategic stability talks in the Nuclear Posture Review as of April 2010. So don't expect, a result by the end of the seminar. It takes a long time to exchange views, and not necessarily for them to come around to our view, but for us ultimately to be a meeting of the mind sufficiently, if not to have a treaty, then to have an understanding, a common understanding, an agreement, a code of conduct, the rules of the road. So we're not in an adversarial position with them. We don't seek to be in an adversarial position with Russia or China on any of these military issues. But I hope this gives you an overall flavor for what was motivating the objective. There has been finally controversy over the actual effectiveness of these systems, which we can talk about. As I mentioned, they can be overwhelmed, they can be defeated in various ways, they can be confused. Specified in the Missile Defense Review report is the stipulation that before new capabilities are deployed, they must undergo testing that enables assessment under realistic operational conditions. And this is because a number of the tests early on were not under realistic operational conditions, and people said they were kind of rigged. They were easy. They said, look, there is the target over there, missile, go over there, which is, you know, the Iranians won't be helping us find them. So there has been an effort in the Missile Defense Agency to establish more realistic conditions. This itself, I would say, is contentious. You can look at the parameters of the test and say this is not realistic. So it's a work in progress. But the full phase adaptive approach isn't expected to be deployed till 2020. That's still 8-9 years away. So we have time through many, many tests and an iteration of the capabilities and the deployment plans and the rest to build a high confidence system. Would it be foolproof? Will it be perfect? No. Could it deter potential adversaries? Possibly. Could it reassure allies? Probably. Could it possibly improve relations with Russia and China? Yes. Is it worth doing, in my judgment? Yes. So I think it's a very thoughtful, carefully constructed approach, and that's basically my set of remarks and sort of why we established what we did and where we're sort of headed in policy terms. Thank you.
Michael, thank you. That was a very nice setting of the stage. We're going to move more to the technical side, but I don't want anyone here to think that either Professor Postol or Dr. Wilkening don't understand the politics of the situation. So it'll seem a little more technical, but by people that are skilled in the world of political give and take. I really like standing room only. It's just terrific, and I appreciate it. But there is no need for people to be standing with at least 4 chairs here. So that I wanted to invite Professor McQuaid. There's a seat here for you. Okay.
Take your message.
Thanks.
Gotta get back to you.
Our next speaker is Dean Wilkening. Dean will use slides. I wish you had a laser pointer, but I couldn't get one.
Move away so I can see. I'd love to see this.
Yeah. Okay. I've already introduced Dean, so we'll move right to the substance. Over to you.
Thank you, Harold. Thanks to the Institute for hosting this, and also thanks to the audience for your forbearance, since I was formerly affiliated with Stanford. So I hope you'll take that apology. I'm going to go through some slides to give you a flavor for the capability of the phased adaptive approach. And let me begin by jumping off where Michael ended his comments. In my view, missile defense is becoming technically feasible. We're at the very early stages of exploring this technology and building systems that are beginning to work. There's still some challenges. It is not a perfect system, but this technology, in my mind, is good technology. This is not Star Wars. This is not like the SDI. This is very concrete, potentially quite effective technology. In fact, the hit-to-kill interceptors, I don't know if you're familiar with these interceptors work by maneuvering and physically colliding with their targets. That actually was developed out of the Star Wars program. There was an experiment called the Homing Overlay Experiment in 1984, which was part of the Star Wars, or the Strategic Defense Initiative, where it was first demonstrated that you could actually physically collide, have the guidance accuracy sufficient to collide with a target in outer space. And that experiment has basically spawned the entire set of interceptor-based missile defense assets we have today. I'm going to focus on Europe. As Michael said, the phased adaptive approach really applies to any region, Northeast Asia in particular, but as well as Europe. Most of the discussion these days is about Europe, so I'm going to focus on that as well. One usually starts with some sense of the threat. And for Europe, we focus on Iran. Iran has a fairly active missile program, largely consisting of liquid propellant missiles, but they're doing some interesting experiments on solid propellants. Today, they have Scud-Cs, an old Soviet-era missile. They have the Shahab-3, about a 1,300 kilometer range missile, liquid missile. The technology probably received from North Korea. This is the North Korean Nodong missile. And they have recently tested a solid propellant missile with a range of anywhere from 2,000 to 2,500 kilometers, somewhere in that range. And some people are suggesting we may see a liquid propellant missile in the range of about 3,000 kilometers in the not too distant future. So today, the threat is really quite, the missile threat from Iran is quite localized to the Middle East. Obviously, Israel is very concerned about it because they're within range of the Shahab-3. Turkey could be concerned about it, but Turkey is a friend of Iran, which is one reason why they resisted NATO attempts to join the missile defense effort until very recently, and they agreed to deploy a radar, which you'll see on some future maps right about here in Turkey. In the next, say, several years, 5 years, the missile ranges are starting to encroach on southeastern Europe, or it could be southern Russia as well, or other regions. The Saudis are concerned about Iranian missile capabilities. And then in the out years, let's say within a decade or so, Iran probably can have the capability to launch missiles that cover the entire European continent. The Bush administration was mostly concerned about ICBMs, intercontinental range ballistic missiles that hit the US homeland, either from North Korea or Iran. In my view, they got the order backwards. It's these medium range missiles that are proliferating quite widely. Intercontinental range missiles are a far-term threat. How far? How long will it take before Iran gets them? Who knows? On the order of a decade, maybe 2. So this is the threat that animates the European phased adaptive approach. Now, mind you, without a nuclear warhead on these missiles, they don't pose much of a threat. They could be a political threat. We saw conventionally armed missiles launched in the Middle East and the Gulf War. But in my mind, without some sort of weapon of mass destruction, in particular a nuclear warhead, these missiles aren't particularly, I wouldn't be spending billions of dollars to defeat them. But of course, Iran does have a suspect nuclear weapons program, and you've been reading a lot about that in the newspaper recently. And so the concern is, again, we don't know the time frame, but they can build a nuclear device to stick on top of a ballistic missile with ranges like this, and they could potentially threaten Europe. So that's what's animating the European phased adaptive approach. Michael talked about it. Emphasis on near-term threats, medium range, intermediate range missiles, not ICBMs first. Larger raid sizes. They use this language, emphasis on proven technology. That's because the Theodore, or the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, is a fairly mature theater missile defense system, but we used to call theater missile defense systems. The language has changed a little bit. The Standard Missile-3, which is a naval system, is quite mature. The ground-based interceptor that's up in Alaska that people talked about is the least reliable of the hit-to-kill interceptors we have. This is the one that's been failing in several test flights for a host of reasons. Not only is it less reliable, it's also more expensive, on the order of $70 million per interceptor, whereas these other ones here are down in the THAAD, maybe 6 million, or no, excuse me, 9 million. 10 to 15 million for the Standard Missile-3. So this architecture built on these more mature missile defense assets is going to be less expensive. But most people talk about the interceptors. That's what captures the public's imagination. In fact, the most important asset, or the most important technology behind missile defense, is the sensors, the sensor architecture, and the command and control system. The sensors are radars, the Spy-1 radar on the Aegis cruiser, and what's called the forward-based X-band radar, or the so-called TPY-2. This is the radar that is associated with the THAAD missile defense systems. Both these radars are quite mature. THAAD, the TPY-2 in particular, is a very sophisticated and very effective radar. There are also optical sensors, airborne infrared and space-based optical systems that are maturing quite rapidly, and these have figured into the phased adaptive approach. Not only these types of sensors, but they're all going to be supposedly a large number of them, and they're all going to be netted together. So the data from any one sensor can be shared with any shooter, any interceptor in the system, and that's an extremely important attribute, as I'll show you in a second. There are 4 phases, again, as Michael mentioned. They are based on different variants of the Standard Missile 3. So the Block 1A is out there today on ships. That's phase 1, 2011. That timetable was met. The Block 1B interceptor, it's got a same interceptor, but it's got a different kill vehicle on the end of it, a more sophisticated one. That's undergoing flight tests right now. That's supposed to be deployed on ships and in Romania, the Veselu. That's the base that Michael mentioned was negotiated. Phase 3 is the Block 2A interceptor. It's an interceptor that was jointly developed between the United States and Japan. As I said, the Japanese are cooperating on this venture as well, and this is a jointly designed system that's supposed to be deployed in Poland at Vitskovo. And then finally the Block 2B, which was supposed to be a more advanced version still on ships and on land around Europe in 2020. Funding for this missile was just cut recently in the 2012 budget because Congress was concerned that there are too many concurrent development projects underway, and so they've axed the funding for this. The netted sensor architecture, an extremely important aspect. Multiple radars, Spy-1, TPY-2, maybe NATO radars. If one gets into the discussion about Russian cooperation, there are possibilities for Russian radars being tied into this whole system. Infrared tracking, whether it's airborne or space-based. And then a command and control system to tie all this together, as I said, so any shooter can launch off of any particular sensor data, track data. So here is the evolution of the Standard Missile, 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B, launched off of these vertical launch tubes and Aegis cruisers. This is the Spy-1 radar. This is the radar face here. This is the top of the Aegis cruiser. You can't quite see it very well, but it's just this radar face here. This is a picture of the THAAD radar. This is the radar face down here. Here's the power van, some cooling equipment and other things. But this is a movable radar, not quite mobile. It's very powerful, high frequency radar. And if you look at Europe, and I start placing these various radars, there's one located in Israel today. The one at Kurichek in Turkey is located about here. And this is a picture of what that radar fan could see, the volume of space it could see against a radar cross-section. This tells you sort of how large the object is to the radar. This is a fairly small cross-section, but is sort of representative of what might be coming off the end of Iranian ballistic missiles. This also shows the Spy-1 radar coverage. The Spy-1 radar has 4 faces. Here's a ship in the Eastern Mediterranean. This actually was the, not quite the exact location, but the phase 1 deployment was an Aegis ship in the Eastern Med. And so this ship moves around here, could be deployed down here to help protect Israel in the case of conflict. Now, there's been some debate about whether this is a land-based site, and as I just said, Spy-1 and SM-3 are naval-based assets. And so the question is, well, operating ships 24/7 is fairly expensive, so they're talked about putting it on land to try to reduce costs. What's the radar that goes with this? I've shown it here with an with a Spy-1 radar. As you can see, the range of this radar is fairly small. It's probably not the best radar. There have been other people that have talked about using THAAD radars or different systems. And to some extent, the jury is still out on exactly what sensor will be coupled to that system. But in any case, the radar coverage is fairly small. This is the airborne infrared system. Actually, this is a Reaper drone. Here's the sensor ball down here. This is the drone that's being used over in Afghanistan. The idea is to take this sensor ball and look up with it and use it to track ballistic missiles. Again, this is sort of an off-the-shelf system that you could use right away. It's not, in that configuration, it's not exactly what you'd want for missile defense, but it's a beginning. Whoops. And in fact, if you designed a better airborne infrared system than that picture I just showed you, this shows you sort of the area of space looking down on the Earth that a infrared system could see. If you're familiar with infrared systems, it depends on the temperature of the object you're looking at, because these things detect the black body radiation, the heat coming off the object. And so for warmer objects at 300 Kelvin, that's room temperature, you can see quite a ways, about 1,000 kilometers or more with one of these infrared sensors. For colder objects, 250 Kelvin, that's minus 50 degrees or so, or minus 30 degrees centigrade. The detection range, the tracking range is not quite as good. But you can see 3 orbits in and around Europe, you get substantial coverage. Why is that important? If I go back to the radar picture, here's a notional intermediate range, 4,000 kilometer, intermediate range ballistic missile launched out of central Iran heading towards Europe. And these are those radar pictures. That forward-based X-band radar, the trajectory flies through that fairly reliably. But the problem is these Aegis radars, the target overflies the radar. The radar just doesn't even see them. And so this is one of the main roles for the airborne infrared system. If I overlay a 300-degree Kelvin contour and I put the airborne infrared in the Black Sea off the coast of Romania, now I get good three-dimensional coverage over Europe. And it's this sensor that starts providing the track information for me to consummate my engagements. Okay, well now let me talk a little bit about the defended area. And this is one way to look at whether the system is effective or not. Can you defend an area as large as Europe with a handful of interceptor sites? And this is based on calculations I did at Stanford some months back. And I want to introduce 3 concepts which are extremely important to the phased adaptive system, but is rarely talked about in the newspaper. And so you can, it's quite easy to misunderstand it. There are several modes of operation for a missile defense system. One is standalone operation, where the radar that is associated with the interceptor carries out all the tracking, guidance, and communicates to the interceptor and consummates the engagement by itself. No external sensor helps out in the process. Standalone operation. Launch on remote is a mode where, well, actually I could show you here. I'm going to show you some maps of how wide an area a Standard Missile 3-like system. This is not, it's sort of a notional Standard Missile 3, and I have a couple different speeds for these missiles. I'm going to show you the area that you can defend. So here's standalone operation. Here's looking at Deveselu. Here's those radar fans associated with the Spy-1 radar, assuming it's Spy-1 that's put in Romania. And here's a missile trajectory. That forward-based Turkish radar picks it up, communicates with this radar to look right around this region of the radar coverage because you're going to see something coming in. So it cues this radar where to look. This radar then starts scanning this portion of the sky, detects the object, tracks it, launches the interceptor, and has to carry out this intercept before the object falls too deep into the atmosphere for the interceptor to work properly. When I operate in that mode, I can defend an area on the ground that looks like this yellow patch you can barely see down here. It's a very small defended area. It tends to be behind the interceptor site. but this is sort of a standard mode of operation for defenses. It's also fairly ineffective for protecting large areas. Launch on remote is where I use track data from some other sensor, in this case this forward-based X-band radar in Turkey, and it tracks this object. I send that track information to the interceptor here. I launch my interceptor based on this radar's track, but then I consummate the engagement within the field of view of this radar. In other words, this radar has to watch the target, watch the interceptor, and tell them approximately how close they're getting. That's called launch on remote. You launch the interceptor on remote track data. This mode of operation has been tested out in the field, and they've had success so far. But if you can see, this is Europe here. The defended area is certainly growing compared to standalone, but it's still not that large. The most effective mode of operation, and the one that the European phase adaptive approach is heading towards, is called engage on remote. An engage on remote, I have some forward sensor, in this case this radar here, picks up a track. I launch my interceptor based on this track information, and I consummate the engagement. That is to say, some other sensor, a second sensor, in this case the airborne infrared here, keeps tracking this, tracks the interceptor missile, and the only thing that the radar, in this case the SPY-1, does is it's a communication link to communicate to the interceptor and say, okay, the ABIR, the airborne infrared data, tells me this is where it's heading, so adjust your track until you have an engagement. This is called engage on remote. So you launch on remote and you consummate the engagement based on another sensor, and you essentially remove the radar, in this case, that's co-located with the interceptor site. That's the most effective mode of operation. Okay, so now let me turn to defensive Europe. Phase 1, this is what the defended area looked like. I assume launch on remote would work. We have one ship in the Eastern Med. Here's the kind of threat, the Shahab 3. This ship could move down and defend Israel, could move up around Greece. You could provide some localized defense in the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean. You'd probably need 2 or 3 ships if there was a real war that broke out. Maybe some down here defending other assets. But that's what the defense picture looks like today. We have a forward-based radar in Turkey and one ship or a handful of ships using the Block 1A interceptor that is out in the field today. Phase 2, 3 years from now. Largely the same picture. Now we have the Standard Missile 1B, an improved interceptor on land at the Veselu, also in the Eastern Med. Maybe you'll have a couple of the ships here. And by now, 3 years from now, the range of missile threats might extend out to 2,000 kilometers, something like that. So again, fairly localized defense of southeastern Europe with 2, 3, maybe 4 sites, something like that. Things get interesting at Phase 3, 2018. Now we're supposed to have the Block 2A interceptor, and it's supposed to be deployed on land at Ryckowo in Poland. This is where the interceptor site's going to be. One of the issues one gets into is there's not a lot of information in the public domain. All these charts are based on public domain information. We don't know how fast the 2A interceptor flies, and speed matters in this business. So what I've done is I show a family of curves from 3.5 to 4.5 kilometers a second, representing the kind of coverage you would get from Poland of Europe, varying the interceptor speed. And again, maybe the missile threats would extend throughout all of Europe, who knows? But I've shown the maximum range threat that would reach England. And importantly, this assumes engage on remote. So you have to have these sensors, airborne sensors and whatnot, to provide all the track data for this to operate. Now you get huge defended areas. Just from one site alone, you can practically defend all of Europe at the higher interceptor speeds. Engage on remote will also be implemented down at the Veselu. Now I've shown these airborne infrared platforms orbiting, and again, a family of curves. Maybe the Romanian site will remain with a slower interceptor. Maybe they'll put a faster one in there, who knows. But if I put these two together, by 2015, let's assume that the speed is 4 kilometers a second, and I have Engage on Remote. I have 2 land-based sites alone, and with Engage on Remote, I can cover the entire continent of Europe. In fact, I could get shots from both of these sites for any missile heading in towards the center of Europe. I didn't point this out, but it's clear here in this chart. This radar in Turkey, the Turks only agreed to put a radar there, no interceptors. And unfortunately, it's outside the defended area for most of the other assets. If I went back, I could show you Aegis has a hard time defending it. Romania has a hard time defending it. This asset is an extremely important radar location and needs to be defended. If I put a THAAD battery there, after all, the radar is just the radar that goes with the THAAD system, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. So if I just put the whole battery there instead of just the radar, this is the kind of defended area you would get, so you'd start defending certainly the radar itself, if not central Turkey. If I don't have Engage on Remote and all I have is Launch on Remote, this is what the picture looks like. Here's the Polish site, the Romanian site. I didn't put any naval interceptors around there. If we don't get Engage on Remote, the defense, the broad area defense of Europe is virtually impossible unless you start proliferating interceptor sites all over the place. So that highlights the importance of that particular aspect of the defense. I was talking earlier with Harold about the issue of Russia, and I want to at least touch on a little bit of why the Russians are concerned. But phase 4 of the European phase adaptive approach is really designed to defend the United States, not Europe. Up through phase 3, that's defense of Europe. Phase 4 is defending the continental United States. So here I put interceptors in Poland. This is circa 2020. I assume Engage on Remote, and I assume a Standard Missile 3 Block 2B of different speeds. And this shows the defended footprint going against an Iranian ICBM. Let's assume they have an ICBM. This is the maximum range of the ICBM I've assumed here, slicing through the United States. If the interceptor speed is 4.5 kilometers a second, which is very fast for defending Europe, this is the defended area in here. You really cannot protect the United States. If I increase that speed to 5 kilometers a second, now I can do a good job of defending the eastern part of the United States, but the west coast is a little bit out of the footprint. I haven't shown you the capability of the Fort Greely site up here, the GBI, which actually can defend this whole area. So 5 kilometers a second, the forward base site could help defend the east coast, Fort Greely, the west coast, so that would work. But if you want to cover the entire continental United States, from Poland, your interceptor speed has to be up around 5.5 kilometers a second. Much faster than any of the SM-3 interceptors that are being talked about. Much faster, well, at least 1 kilometer a second faster. Now, why are the Russians concerned? This chart shows you the footprint, the defended area for Russian ICBMs of different flavors launched from all the known launch locations in Russia for a 5 kilometer a second interceptor, which is high for any of the SM-3 interceptors that are currently being talked about. So if I put that SM-3 Block 2B and it has a speed as high as 5 kilometers a second in Poland, which has been the source of most of Russia's concerns, you really can't protect the United States. Here's Maine. Only the SS-27s and SS-19s out of Tadashevo, you might be able to catch them going to Maine, but the rest of the United States and Alaska and Hawaii, you cannot intercept those ICBMs. To threaten Russia's ICBMs from European launch sites, the interceptor speed has to be up above 5 kilometers a second, closer to 6 or something like that. So just to summarize, the kinds of observations I'd like to draw from this. Engage on remote is absolutely essential. The sensor architecture and the battle management system to tie all those assets together is key to this system. If you don't have it, the system doesn't work. Phase 1, 2 ships, 3 ships, decent coverage with launch on remote, same with phase 2. Phase 3 is where things get interesting, where supposedly engage on remote capability is going to be available. 2 sites, covers all of Europe. Turkey is outside that defended area, especially that radar, so you need to deploy THAAD there, so that's the follow-on discussions with the Turks, is how about accepting a few interceptors. Phase 4, defense of the United States. You really have to be above 5 kilometers a second to protect the United States from a European launch location. If you do get above 5, 5.5, 6 kilometers a second, it's even better still, then you can do a nice job defending the United States. The problem is now you start potentially posing a threat to Russia. So you can't have your cake and eat it too. You cannot defend the United States from Europe against Iranian ICBMs without potentially encroaching on Russian capability, though in my mind you don't encroach on it very much. In fact, I think most of the Russian concerns are more political in nature than the sort of military technical. Sensor issues are key. Airborne infrared, space-based infrared, good sensors. You need more than just 1 or 2 TPY-2 radars, and NATO radars, by the way. The French are developing radars, the Germans, others. Hopefully they'll contribute to the system. Multiple radars, and that rapid command and control system. And I think that's it. Yeah. So that's the kind of capability the system could have. And there are several key pillars that are required to really make this thing work fairly well, which I believe it could. Thanks.
Thank you, Dean. That was very helpful. I personally am left with the question of, you've given defense every benefit of the doubt. You know, everything worked as you said, and yet it doesn't threaten the Russians very much until phase 4. So I tend to come down where you come down, that the Russian objections are much more political than technical. Now that's that flash of brilliance I warned you about, and I will stop at that point. Ted, would you take it up from there?
Do you want to use your?
No, I have more to say than that. Where do I begin?
Ted, I'm more concerned about where you will end. We're running.
Well, I haven't been doing any of the talking so far, so. Let me start out by telling you about a way to protect you. I'm going to put airport security in place to protect you from terrorist attacks on the airplane. However, I'm not going to let anybody x-ray your luggage or anyone else's luggage. I'm not going to let anybody look into the luggage. I'm not going to let dogs sniff the luggage. I'm simply going to let people look at your luggage and decide based on whatever they think matters, like color, shape, whatever, whether or not it's got a bomb in it, or a gun in it, or whatever. This is basically the level of discrimination capability that these missile defenses have today. In fact, you don't even have to have a suitcase, because a suitcase would actually weigh something. But since you would put a decoy in the near vacuum of space and inflate it, and there was no air drag, this thing could tumble along, and to a distant radar operating at thousands of kilometers range, or to an infrared sensor operating at hundreds of kilometers range in some cases, it would be an object that potentially does or does not carry a nuclear weapon, period. So this, when I start talking about countermeasures later on, keep in mind that hitting the target is not the easy task. I mean, is not the hard task. The hard task is finding the object that's being thrown at you. And if you think decoys are difficult to build, let me give you a general analogy, and before I go into some facts, that is worth contemplating. Imagine you have an adversary that has the technical capability to build a long-range ballistic missile or an ICBM. They have the ability to build a nuclear weapon and a reentry vehicle with a fuse that would properly detonate the nuclear weapon, but they can't figure out how to inflate a balloon and deploy it along with it. Now, if you believe there is such an adversary as that in the world, I've got some bridges to sell you along with a missile defense. Now, I was a little surprised that Mike had worked on the Ballistic Missile Defense Review, because this is something that's near and dear to my heart. I do not see any evidence that the Ballistic Missile Defense Review had any technical input of any kind. I think the document is amazing for the statements it makes. Let me just give you some. I actually wrote a rather elaborate article on it at one point, so I'm off the top. I can't remember anything normally, but this one I happen to remember. Here's an assertion for you from the Ballistic Missile Defense Review. The U.S. is currently defended by the ground-based missile defense system that's deployed in Alaska and at Vandenberg Air Force Base. It's currently defended and will continue to be defended for the foreseeable future, although we should do work to make sure that it stays that way. This is clearly and unambiguously stated in the Ballistic Missile Defense Review. The last test failure in the missile defense program was an experiment sometimes called the FTG 06, followed by a replication of that experiment, the FTG 06A. Those two experiments were set up so as to make it easier to intercept the warhead. I invite people to ask me questions. I want to give you a little bit of an overview here. And in fact, in the process of trying to make the warhead easier to hit, they inadvertently spewed out material that caused the X-band radar to fail, because the material was acted much like what is known as radar chaff, which we know defeats this system. There is no argument about it in a technically sound community. I want to be clear on this. Chaff defeats this system. The Ballistic Missile Defense Review also says that the new breakthroughs in missile defense technology that allow for the ballistic missile defenses, particularly the PAA, to have a chance of working. In fact, the President said that in his speech announcing it on September 17, 2009. Let me be clear. There are no new technologies in the PAA, none. There are no propulsion technologies, there are no sensor technologies, there are no material ballistic missile defense technologies that give this system greater capability. I'll have something more to say about that shortly. The PAA is a proven and effective missile defense. The President said that in September 17, 2009. Yet, if the PAA has never been tested against a tumbling target. Now that means something, because in the Gulf War of 1991, where incidentally the Patriot was originally represented as 96% successful, and our MIT group showed that it was almost certainly 0% successful, so we went from PK equal to 1 to PK equal to 1 to 0. Which should tell you something about this community and its ability to tell the truth. There were tumbling targets at high altitude for reasons I can explain again in the question and answer period. The Al Hussein missile had design features, not flaws, I say features, that caused it to tumble at high altitude and behave very irregularly on reentry, and thereby completely defeated the Patriot. And incidentally, it would completely defeat the Patriot PAC-3 as well. We've examined that. We've actually studied it. If a target is cut into pieces, I take a warhead, I take a missile, and instead of cutting the missile and, if you have a two-stage missile, you cut the first stage away from the second stage. You can just as well cut a single-stage missile into many pieces. The radar and infrared sensors are totally incapable of telling which piece is which and whether there's a warhead or not. So basically, the countermeasure problems that both the ground-based missile defense and the phased adaptive approach face are the same. The technology, they're different. One has got smaller interceptors and slower interceptors. One has got bigger interceptors. But they're both basically useless if they face very simple countermeasures of the kind I've already described. Now let me tell you, this is of course something that I've been talking about for really more than a decade, although the new stuff on the PAA has been over the last few years. The Department of Defense just published a report by the Defense Science Board. In fact, the report was asked for by Ash Carter when he was Assistant Secretary. Now he's Deputy Secretary. And so Ash Carter asked for this report. And let me tell you what I think happened. I'm going to be very cynical here, so those don't be too shocked. I think the Defense Science Board inadvertently hired some contractors to do the study who actually did a study. Because the people who sign these documents, when you get into the Pentagon, you know that the people who sign these documents have nothing to do with actually what the study is. And they were so careless, I say careless because I'm ascribing a motive of concealing information from you, the American people. They were so careless that when the unclassified version of this document was put out, they inadvertently spilled the beans. So let me tell you what this document that the current Deputy Secretary of Defense asked for and is now out there in the open. Incidentally, send me an email. I will send you the letters that a colleague and I wrote to the National Security Advisor just a month ago. We haven't received a reply to it, but there's going to be a newspaper article on it. The Defense Science Board report stated the following: none of the radars in the phased adaptive approach, none of them are up to the job of actually supporting the system's workability. None of them. They're all too short range. I will show you a chart, if necessary, that will show you that the radar cross-section of a rather large and rather typical cone-shaped warhead is at least 10 times smaller than what Dean showed was the case, at least at X-band. At L-band, it is 1/10 of a square meter. If that radar cross-section is even smaller, that means the range of the radar is not only determined by the power of the radar, its antenna size, the gain, what's called the gain of the antenna, but the radar cross-section of the object, the radar reflectivity of the object, which is in control of the adversary, is what determines the range of the radar. So if an object is very small radar cross-section, and in this case you can typically expect an unsophisticated warhead where there's been no effort to make it stealthy to be 1/100th of a square meter, then all of these radars have even shorter range than what people are claiming. And I would like to point out that it's not hard to make the radar cross-section thousands of square meters at X-band. This is one of the grave problems that X-band radars have. You can easily make a warhead stealthy. Now this Department of Defense report, again the Department of Defense report that the Deputy Secretary asked for, also made an amazing statement. It said something that I've been saying for more than 10 years. So what I've been saying for 10 years is that if you have those suitcases out there and you're just inspecting them with your eyes, you can't tell whether or not there's a bomb in them by just inspecting them with your eyes. You're going to have to sniff them, open up the suitcase and look around. Even then you might fail, but certainly you're not going to be able to identify which suitcase has a bomb by simply looking at it. This is not a very profound statement to say, but there's a lot of technical detail behind this very simple statement, which is correct completely in terms of the analogy I'm giving you. The Defense Science Board report actually says that the Department of Defense has not demonstrated the ability to tell warheads from decoys. This is the report, that unclassified report that Deputy Secretary of Defense Carter had asked for a couple of years ago. It also says that a capability that the Missile Defense Agency has been talking about for a long time, called shoot, look, shoot, has not been demonstrated. Let me just explain this simply. I have an object, I want to destroy it. If I don't have time to shoot at it, see if I destroyed it, and then shoot again, I typically would shoot 2 interceptors simultaneously. Well, if I have this problem, it greatly increases the number of interceptors I need and the expense of my defense. So what has happened is there's been a lot of talk about shoot, look, shoot. You need to get enough what's called battle space. You need to be able to reach out early enough that you can shoot a second interceptor. You have time to shoot a second interceptor if the first fails. But this report states, and I'm sure it's correct, that the shoot, look, shoot is not possible because the Department of Defense has not demonstrated that if they hit a target, they will know that destroyed the warhead, or that they will be able to tell the warhead from other debris that's created if and when they hit a target. As I say, you have lots of pieces of debris, they're coming at you, and if you can't tell that a piece of rocket motor that broke apart in the intercept attempt, or something else that is just traveling along with the warhead is a warhead or a piece of debris, you can't execute shoot, look, shoot. This report says that quite clearly, and it makes the important factual statement, unless they're lying to the Deputy Secretary of Defense, that the Department of Defense has not demonstrated this capability. Now, what this report also does is it releases some interesting intelligence. The intelligence shows that adversaries are already testing missiles that release objects that could be decoys within tens of seconds of the end of powered flight. Now, of course, if you can build a rocket and you can deploy a warhead, you should be able to deploy a balloon. So this should be no surprise unless you have that, unless you want to buy that bridge from me. So this is what we're currently facing. Now let me make a general policy statement. I shudder to do so. Here's the argument in the Ballistic Missile Defense Review. We're going to make it so hard for these people to use ballistic missiles that we are actually going to deter them from using it. We're going to cause them to throw up their hands and give up. Now, that could be true. You know, I'm not opposed to the use of military force in all situations. I've worked in with the military, and I have great admiration for what they do and how they do it. Some things, of course. But you can only deter an adversary if you have a credible capability to do what you claim. If you don't have a credible capability to do what you claim, you may actually encourage the adversary to go ahead and build ballistic missiles and decoys. And if you want to cement relationships with our allies, I think you're going to have some very angry allies if you claim you're defending them and they wind up with a nuclear warhead shoved down their throat because they've been told that they can deal with it. So these are some general statements that I was not intending to make when I first, you can stop me at any point if you think it's getting too violent.
I wouldn't dare.
I don't bite, I just kick. So I want to just make a few points that I had actually planned to stay, and I'll try to cut them short because obviously I've taken time on this other matter. How does the Bush system differ from the phased adaptive approach? Well, what the phased adaptive approach does is it substitutes a very large number of smaller and slower interceptors for a very small number of very large interceptors. That's a simple-minded way of stating it, but now these interceptors are on mobile platforms, except of course when they're on these few sites in Europe. It is not true that you need a 5 kilometer per second interceptor to defend the United States with this system, at least in theory. Incidentally, I agree, well, you actually think it would work. I don't think it will work at all, so why am I concerned about it? Which is a question I'd like to address. But you only need a 4 kilometer per second interceptor. You could defend the United States with that. And a 4.5 kilometer per second does even better. And there's very little uncertainty in the public domain about the speed of this interceptor. It's 4.5 kilometers per second. I've talked to numerous people in the Department of Defense, the White House, the Congress who have access. Nobody has ever suggested this interceptor is not 4.5 kilometers per second. Let me make clear, you cannot determine whether this interceptor is 4.5 kilometers per second because the nature of its design is that it's a very inefficient rocket system because it's designed mostly for safety, because people in our Navy don't like to get blown up by their own missiles if you have an accident on your ship. And I generally agree with them, having worked with the Navy. I think that their strategy on that point is quite good. So let me ask the question, is the current BMD strategy based on sound fundamentals? I would argue no. Not in terms of the logical reasoning that somebody who's trying to be a strategist would argue, because strategy ultimately has to be implemented. And if you can't implement a strategy, if you don't have the means to implement a strategy, then having a strategy that's not based on realistic means to implement it is simply crazy, especially when it's a military strategy. Technically, the problems are very severe because you have no ability to tell decoys from warheads, and decoys would be extremely effective in reducing the capabilities of this system. Let me give you a couple of quotes from this report that the Deputy Secretary asked for. This is actually out of the report. The successful operations of these defense systems, that's my addition, is predicated on an ability to discriminate in the exoatmosphere. That means in the vacuum of space. Discriminate the missile warheads from other pieces of offensive missile complex, such as rocket bodies, miscellaneous hardware, and intentional countermeasures. The importance of achieving reliable mid-course discrimination cannot be overemphasized. That's the report statement. Then it goes on to say the Department of Defense has not demonstrated this. So they have made a statement about what the system requirement is. By that I mean, we sit down, we design a system, we say, it has to do this well to meet our objective. Then we look at the technological possibilities, and if we're being honest, we say, well, this system cannot meet these military objectives, and we throw it out and start over and look for something else, or spend our resources on a military enterprise that makes more sense if we're just talking totally military. I'm not getting into the question of whether or not the resources should be spent on other issues. That's a big question and it deserves discussion, but I won't treat it here. So, why are the Russians worried about phase 3 of this system. Now, phase 3 is important. It's not phase 4 they're worried about. They're worried about phase 3. And I don't think it's political myself. That's my judgment. I could be wrong, though. There is certainly a high political component to this whole game that both the United States and Russia is playing. So you'd have to be deaf, dumb, and blind to not realize that this is so political, it's hard to believe. In fact, I think it's so political that the people in the White House don't even care whether or not this system works. They're so worried about the Republicans calling them cowards that that's what's the concern. And let me tell you, I meet with people in the White House. I don't say who, but that's where the fear is. Because there are people in the White House who understand exactly the technical facts that I'm describing here. So, if the system has no capability, why are the Russians worried? Well, let me just step back for the phase 3, why phase 3 is important. Phase 3 is supposed to come in somewhere between 2018 and 2020. It's scheduled for 2018, but it turns out they're so far behind in building the kill vehicle for the phase 3 that it probably would be 2020. In 2020, New START comes to an end, and the United States begins a new arms reduction negotiation with Russia. The Russians have said, we regard this system as threatening, and we're going to withdraw from all future arms reductions with the United States after New START ends, or we might even withdraw from New START at some point because we are so concerned about this. And I can tell you that people I'm working with, and some of them are big Pentagon insiders, are very worried about this. And they should be, because I think the Russians are very serious. All right, but why are they worried about this system? Because, I just told you, it's worthless. It's just your money. But, after all, Wall Street took care of that as well. And of course, the people in the White House are protecting you from Wall Street, just as they're protecting you from these foreign missiles. And incidentally, that's not an accident, because I used to be sick over this missile defense issue, but then I saw what we did with regard to Wall Street, and I said, yeah, if people can't deal with this threat to our country, how can they deal with missile defense if they're not concerned enough about this? And I know a little bit about it right now. I've spent some time learning about economics. And by the way, since I've learned about economics, to just make a point, I used to tell people that I worked in an area that was distinguished by its intellectual poverty. But now that I know something about economics, I no longer say that. Okay, so why does this give you the best of the worst of both worlds? First of all, the other guy building missile defenses unleashes very powerful bureaucratic forces. So if I'm in China or Russia, or for that matter in the United States, as we saw when Merving occurred, when we built all these multiple warheads that got us all into so much trouble, I point at the other guy's missile defense and I say, hey, we need more missiles. And if you don't give me more missiles, I'm going to go and find a way to make my case to your political adversaries or to the people and point out that you're not doing what you need to do to defend this country. Now, anybody who looks at this Obama administration, the way it's behaved when faced with threats, should have no trouble understanding that this can occur in other political environments. This is not a unique vulnerability of democratic societies. Many people think that Mr. Putin is going to harden up even more because he wants to show his electorate in Russia that he's in charge and he's going to build on fears people have. I would be glad to tell you unfounded fears, but we're dealing with a social, technical, political phenomenon here. It's not purely technical, it's not purely social, it's not purely political. It's very difficult for political leaders to resist these forces. And that occurs in all societies, no matter what the political system is like. So, what does the adversary's leadership really think? That's a question that you're going to ask if you're the military planner on the other side. So when I see I worked in the Pentagon. I was a scientific advisor to the Chief of Naval Operations, so I'm highly sensitized to who says what. So when I see General James Cartwright in front of the Senate saying that if he was actually asked by, I forget the senator now, he was actually asked by a member of the committee, if there was a crisis between the United States and North Korea, what advice would he give the President of the United States about with regard to the ground-based missile defense system? And he said, oh, I would tell the President that he could have complete confidence in the system. You could see the eyebrows raised in the Senate, among the senators. Now, this guy is the second most senior member of our military. I worked on nuclear war plans, and I really worked on them. I was at the ground zero level. I mean, I really had a lot of access when I was in the Pentagon, and I was helping to integrate Trident I into the force when it was just coming in there. So I know what goes on in these plans. And it should make your hair stand on end. What these statements of a military leader of that level does is it potentially creates the possibility of a misunderstanding by leadership. When I was in the Pentagon, I looked at the Moscow ABM system, a worthless system. A worthless system. I could go into I give a lecture on the Moscow ABM system in one of my courses. I sat and looked at that system and I said, why are they doing this? What do they believe? What might they do in a crisis or a confrontation that could inadvertently get us into a nuclear war because they believe something about this system that's not true? So from the point of view of the military planner, the fact that the system doesn't have capability doesn't stop them from speculating about the potential for accidents that could lead to nuclear war. Let me just end here because I can see Harold's getting out the club. And I'm sure my other colleagues here will have their own clubs to use against me. Thanks.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you very much. I want to thank all three speakers, of course. Michael, do you want to share? I had promised, and I will keep that promise, that we'll take some time just to let the three speakers clarify what the other speaker may have said or may have not said. I think we'll keep the same order as we had. That is, Michael, would you like to just comment on what Dean and Ted have said?
Yes, I'll be very brief because we want comments from the floor. I'll just say a couple of things. First of all, Dean has been an advisor to the Defense Department on these issues. So, recently and currently. So he is very knowledgeable about the strengths and limitations of these systems. He's also done, I think, with Walt Slocum, a National Academy study.
It may explain his position.
Okay, maybe. Okay. Let me
just to be clear.
Let me just comment on two points that Ted raised. One is, was there any technical input to the ballistic missile defense review? Or actually, I think he said there was no technical input. So these were some of the technical groups that pored over the details of our systems. And remember, we're talking about systems that are in the process of evolving over a decade. Right? And there's always lots of uncertainty here, both in terms of what we're going to find out about our own systems and what we might find out about the threat. Technical groups represented in the review included, and you have to make your own judgment about their capability of veracity, from the Missile Defense Agency itself, from the Navy, from the Air Force, from the Office of Science Technology Policy, from the White House, from the Joint Staff of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, from several of the national laboratories, and others. There were reviews, or at least interactions with technical experts in Britain, France, and other countries in the NATO alliance and other allies. These concepts and plans were briefed to the most senior Russians, who had many technical experts present. So the notion that the Ballistic Missile Defense Review report was completely unrelated to any technical input is factually not correct. Now
No, that you didn't address the question.
Well,
The fact that you're appealing to different organizations playing a role, I've been in the Pentagon, I've watched these charades put on. You go and you talk to a bunch of different people, you select what you want to say, and you say it. Now, if you have some facts with regard, are you willing to say, for example, that the current missile defense system is defending the United States right now? Do you believe that?
That's a different point. That's
No. What do you mean? That's the key point.
The first point, just
we've got to let
we can't
Mike
get
have
into
his say.
an exchange.
You can't get into it.
Well,
a substantive exchange.
I'm happy to
We're
do
gonna
it.
talk about appeal to
I'm
authority.
responding to a couple of the points you made. If you'd like to respond after that, you're welcome.
Respond to the factual point I stated.
I'm responding in the way I'd like to respond, not the way you'd like to respond.
Fine.
So that's the first point. It's factually incorrect. Second point, was the motivation of the administration solely to appease the Republicans? Nothing could be further from the truth. When the report was released, it was denounced by senior Republican senators, intimately familiar with missile defense, members of the Armed Services Committee, as a sellout to the Russians, that we were appeasing the Russians by withdrawing the interceptor from Poland. That also was not true. We were developing a set of systems and plans, as I described, which would, over a 10-year period, make it increasingly difficult for potential adversaries to use ballistic missiles against targets in Europe in any sort of cost-free calculation. It would be increasingly difficult for them. Are we aware that they would use decoys? Of course we're aware. This is kindergarten level understanding. We've done a lot of work on decoys, a lot of work, more work that is publicly available. We've done a lot of work on how to defeat decoys. Do we have all the answers? No. Will we have all the answers in 2020? I don't know, probably not. Will we increase the doubt that potential adversaries could be effective in their attacks and therefore give them pause, cause them to not attack? In other words, enhance deterrence? I think yes. Do we have the credibility to use these systems? 100%. Do we have the intent to use them? 100%. If deterrence is about credibility and credibility is about will and capability, we will have substantially more capability tomorrow than we have today, and we will have 100% intent to use it. And I can assure you that the Iranian government is fully aware of this, and the North Korean government is fully aware of it. And if you think they are more encouraged and more likely to use these systems because of the weaknesses in the systems, that is a misreading of the situation. Now, just very briefly on the national missile defense. I didn't talk about that in my talk. Others raised it briefly. Just on the table, we have two systems, modest systems, one in Fort Greely, Alaska, one in Vandenberg Air Force Base, that are coupled with other radars around the world, intended to defend the continental United States, not against a full-scale attack from Russia, but against limited attacks from other adversaries. This is a policy that the US has sustained. Obama sustained the Bush policy. He's chosen not to augment the capability. That also has been attacked by Republican senators. So we have a system in place, again, just to demonstrate the willingness to defend the United States against limited attacks. And we have this growth of regional networked systems that are intended to make it more difficult for them to attack regional targets. Final point, conceptually, missile defense involves 3 layers of attack. It's sometimes called a layered defense. Slightly artificially, the trajectory of the attacking missile is divided into boost phase, mid-course, and terminal phase. And different elements of the defense are focused on each phase of the trajectory of the attacking missile. So there's boost phase intercept, which is tough. There's mid-course intercept, and there's terminal intercept. And as these technologies mature, and as the networks and the sensor networks mature, we have expectations that the ability to degrade the attacking missile in either boost phase, mid-course, or terminal phase will grow, so that the likelihood of penetration will be reduced. You know, we say in policy is about prediction. You establish a policy because you expect that if you do it, it's most likely that the following will result. Sometimes you're right, sometimes you're wrong. But I think it's not helpful, it's not constructive, although it's often done, to impugn the motives purely for grounds other than the technical capability. And Dr. Carter, who we all know very well, who was Undersecretary of Defense at the time of the Missile Defense Report, not Assistant Secretary, and who's now Deputy Secretary, who is a noted technology and policy expert, a Rhodes Scholar, a PhD in physics from Oxford, a longtime Harvard faculty member.
A former close friend of mine.
Ultimately, and will now be one of the key figures in the Defense Department as Deputy Secretary to oversee and evaluate the progress of the missile defense program. So I think we have the best capability we could have looking at this. It's a free and fair society, and we're delighted to get the criticisms when they're on particular points. I think the administration is willing to trade. By the way, I should finally add, sorry I'm going on longer than 5 minutes, that members of the Congress and the congressional committee staffs have some excellent technical experts, and they've looked at these systems too. It's a work in progress, but I certainly personally believe that the motivations are sound. They're in the defense of this country, and that the capability that's been put into it is also quite high, and we're continuing to work the problem. And I think it's a valuable investment. It's about $8 billion a year.
Michael, thank you. Dean, we'll just keep the same order, and please feel free to comment on Michael. And,
very briefly, the thing I like about Ted's analysis is he raises one of the most challenging issues for missile defense, and that's mid-course discrimination. Can you tell decoys and the rest from real warheads? That is the Achilles heel of mid-course defense. Very challenging problem. In my view, while I think the Defense Science Board says the problem has not been solved, we can't do it perfectly, we can do a reasonable job against...
They did not say that. They said we do not have the capability. No, because I think facts...
No one interrupted.
Ted, I'm going to get to that.
No one interrupted you when
Right.
you spoke for 25 minutes. No one interrupted you. Let them speak, then you say what you want.
Then,
okay? Then just stop
the facts
speaking.
ought to be correct.
Well,
you
you can correct them
I am
after
going
he's
to
done.
correct some of the facts.
Not in the middle.
guess what, Ted? I'm going to give you a chance to talk, too.
All right.
Okay.
I mean, your diatribe is not necessarily facts. And no one interrupted the diatribe.
Anytime you want to talk technically with me, please feel free to do so. I
Okay,
haven't
we are
heard a
about-
statement from you other than appeals to authority.
Okay, so
I think Dean was talking last time.
let me try to get at some of these points. The countermeasure debate is a tough one. And I've wrestled with various ways to explain it. In my view, countermeasures, decoys, are not easy to build. Credible ones, that is, the ones that can fool the kinds of radars and infrared sensors we have today. But it is true that if I define a certain missile defense architecture, I can always come up with a countermeasure to defeat it. I can also, once given a countermeasure, I can always design a missile defense system to defeat that countermeasure. Both those statements are true. And so missile defense systems don't work perfectly. The countermeasure issue is not a binary issue. It works, it doesn't. There are lots of different countermeasures. Some of them are easy, almost trivial to defeat. Some are very tough to defeat. And there's a probabilistic calculation. You know, maybe you'll get 20% of them, maybe you get 80% of them, et cetera. But it is a difficult problem. It's being worked very hard. Ted mentioned a couple. Tumbling targets. The Missile Defense Agency is very aware of tumbling targets. I don't believe that's a showstopper. Ted mentioned that if you cut the missile into pieces, that radar and infrared sensors cannot tell the difference between those chunks of missile body and warheads. That is absolutely, technically not true. You can easily, not easily, but you can tell the difference between the two. Defense Science Board report. It's a very good report. I recommend you all, if you'd like to get into technical details. It's called the Science Technology Issues of Early Intercept Ballistic Missile Defense, downloaded from the web. Ted said the report says none of the radars work for the phased adaptive. There's no place in the report that says that. In fact, it says quite the opposite. It says that
the radars don't have adequate range. Is that what it says?
No, it doesn't say that either.
Well, you're wrong.
It says that.
Well, I mean,
says that
Ted, I want you to comment, but all in turn.
If you increase the radar by a factor of 3, then in the most stressing case, the radar is adequate. The Defense Science Board report nowhere says that you cannot discriminate decoys from warheads. That statement is never found in any of these pages. The one place that it says is that the Department of Defense has not demonstrated that you can do kill assessment. That is to say, once a kill vehicle hits something up there and you get this splatter of chunks of stuff coming out of it, do I know that the nuclear warhead has been destroyed? And that is a challenging problem as well. It's a very different problem than the decoy discrimination problem, and that's the one statement they say that has not been demonstrated. But they do not say that the discrimination problem is impossible or can't work. Nor does it say that adversaries are already testing decoys that could defeat the defense. There's a wonderful chart in there that shows foreign decoy release times after the end of the boost phase. Foreign decoys. That's British, French, Russian, Chinese, and anybody else. It does not say North Korean. It does not say Iranian. And so one of the open questions is, the adversaries for the system are Iran, not Russia, not China, maybe the French, I don't know. But we don't know. At least there's no information in the open domain about what Iran and North Korea can do. And so I would submit that their ability to develop decoys that could defeat this system is problematic at best. Finally, it's true the Russians are worried about phase 3. Rather than give you the arguments, I have a paper coming out in Survival, which is a journal published by the International Institute for Strategic Studies, that goes into this whole question about how much of a threat the system is to Russia. Phase 3 does not threaten Russia whatsoever. From Europe, if you think of phase 3 as the Polish deployment, no threat whatsoever. If you put the ships off the coast of the United States, then it could do something, but that's not what the Russians have complained about yet. So
that's not true. We wrote a paper, we published it under the Federation of American Scientists. We looked extensively at the potential that the United States could draw these ships back off the coast and defend the country, at least in principle. I want to be clear that in practice, I don't think this system's going to work at all. It's just another way to pump money out of your pockets to a defense industry. But the 4.5 kilometer per second interceptors on ships could easily defend the United States in theory. To argue that an adversary has a capability but won't use it because they just won't choose to. The phased adaptive approach is supposed to be adaptive by putting it on ships so we can move it all over the place. I think that's in the Ballistic Missile Defense Review. So why we would not, in a crisis, choose to do that would depend on the crisis, because it's certainly a possibility, at least in principle, and to argue that I'm only going to look at this particular military threat but not the other, both of which are within the reach of the technical capacity of the system, is simply to mislead the public. If you tell people from Europe and you also tell them you would have to pull this threat back and use it off the coast of the United States, but you don't believe this would be the case, that's what I would call a comprehensive argument. If you tell them that it can't be done from Europe, and you don't tell them that it can be pulled back, then you're misleading them, in my judgment.
Remember,
okay?
Phase 3 is a land-based
Poland. That's, I'm just saying what I'm... All right, now, since the GMD system is currently defending the U.S., according to the study that you're defending, Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, so we need to go to war against them. That was vetted all over the place, wasn't it? So you're supposed to believe that because the Air Force and the Navy and contractors who get paid to tell the Department of Defense what it wants to hear, and then get used by the Department of Defense to make misleading statements to the public, this is okay. This is what you should accept as authority. What you should do is go and look at the analysis that's published. All right? The warhead, a 3-meter long warhead that I can show you the data for, if we take the trouble to bore you with it, we don't need to, has a radar cross-section below 1/100th of a square meter at X-band. I have the data, I've published it, I know Dean has seen it. I don't understand why it's 0.1 meters, square meters when he's talking about an X-band radar range. That diminishes the range substantially. It means that the radar will not be able to acquire the target at long range, and it also means that if there's any chance of discriminating, you will not have what's called the signal to noise to do it. And let me explain a very simple notion that you'll all understand quickly. If I can only dimly see an object because it's at the threshold of what I can see, then even if I have, in principle, resolution to see it, I still may not be able to identify it relative to other objects that look somewhat similar. Only if it's in bright light where I can really see all the details, I might be able to actually identify one object relative to another. And incidentally, I've got to know what I'm looking for. So when somebody tells me we're going to solve a decoy problem, I have a simple question. If somebody puts a warhead inside a balloon, because we're in space, and they throw out another bunch of balloons with it, and every balloon is designed to look different by forethought, some are painted different colors, some are made different sizes, I'd like to know how you're going to tell it apart. That's a technical question. I'll stop there.
I want to thank you all. This has not been an easy topic to discuss, but I'm pleased to tell you that it's all going to become clear with a single question from Professor Falcone, Professor of Physics, who led the American Physical Society review of ballistic missile defense. So just hang on for just a few seconds and Roger will put us straight.
I'm not sure that's going to be true, Harold, but I'll try. So I can stipulate that this is a complex, a hard problem. So when I think about it, we've got to think about it for a very long term. You know, where are we going to be in 10, 20 years? And I thought about it in 3 dimensions, and people have addressed 2 of those here. One is the political dimension. Can we increase global security by pursuing missile defense? And I don't know, I would hope that conversations among the nations we're having conversations with will inform that question about whether that's going to increase global security. The second are the technical questions. And I would hope that R&D on systems like this would inform that part of the dimension. And we saw that in the boost phase chemical laser area, for example, where things didn't pan out, but I think the program's been stopped or slowed or done away with. And so R&D is an answer to the technical. The third dimension, which is maybe the one that you haven't talked about, and maybe we could refocus a little on that, is it's a prioritization. I mean, we're looking at cuts in DoD budgets. There are lots of other things we can do for global security. Cost obviously comes into this, and no one talked about cost. But how do you think about prioritizing this versus other things we could do? And maybe we could get an answer on that.
Excellent question. I'll keep to the same order if that's okay with you, Michael.
Sure. Well, it's hard, you know, and every constituency is claiming that their area has to be the top priority, or certainly has to be an area that has to be sacrosanct from cuts. Mm-hmm. I think that at the moment, and it's been a while, and it's going to increase, Iran and North Korea are the principal nation-state threats to the United States, to U.S. security, to our allies' security, as nuclear weapon states or incipient nuclear weapon states, and as ballistic missile producers and deployers. And we have to do everything we can, militarily, politically, economically, to meet those threats. And if there are deals that can be cut, arms control and other means of restraint, I think we're all for that. But you have to have substantial military assets put against these threats. And that's what we're doing. So I don't think that missile defense against North Korea and Iran will be cut. Certain elements might be cut. There's a phasing issue. Dean pointed out that the SM-3 Block 2B funding has been cut down the road. But I think this is a priority area.
Dean, did you want to address Roger's third dimension?
Yeah, Roger, I wish there was an answer to that question, because it's the $64,000 question, not just in defense area, but in healthcare and all public policy arenas. In fact, it's a great subject for the Goldman School to work on. How do you allocate resources from competing demands? And I know of no good, rational, clear way to do it. In my mind, the liability of missile defense is, the issue is not so much the technical issues, it's rather the, what's the term of art, the opportunity costs. So I spend $10 billion a year on missile defense. Would that be better spent augmenting special forces, augmenting the Navy for operations in the Pacific, since we've pivoted to the Pacific? What about land forces? What about Air Force? What about space? What about cyber? And that's all DoD stuff. What about our economy? I mean, if our economy goes down the tanks, all the guns in the world are not going to shore our country up. So you've got guns and butter trade-offs. I wish I knew a way to make those allocations, but I don't. It's a classic problem. And the way the decision gets made on the Hill and in the Pentagon, I think it's just, they hold a finger up in their debates, competing interests, and a decision gets made. May not be optimal.
Ted, would you like to address Roger's question?
Yeah. First of all, I think if the country feels it needs a missile defense, it has to do it in a realistic way. None of this hand-waving appeals to all, the Air Force and this and that. We all know how the system functions. Any of us who's been in the Pentagon, as I've been in it, knows that you can get any answer you want there. As far as the question of discrimination is concerned, I think there's a simple way to at least think of it from the point of view of a physicist, which I would argue is the easiest way to characterize the problem, and then there are engineering details, which are, of course, important. You have to ask, are there physical observables associated with the different objects that I can exploit that will allow me to tell the difference between warheads and decoys? And can the adversary develop a strategy to deny even those variables, those physical observables? So, for example, the example I gave earlier, yes, you could look at a balloon, and if it's in the sun, it might be hotter than if it's not. If it's got something in it, it might be cooler or hotter depending on the thermal exchange with the object inside. But is it plausible that an adversary can't just go ahead, put a warhead in a balloon and put other kinds of balloons out there and heat them and or not? And can you conceive of a set of physical variables that you can measure with adequate precision, practical, you're a physicist, that will tell you which of these objects contain a warhead? I submit the answer is no. And I worked on this in great detail, this idea that somehow there's new science. I worked on the Trident II, not the Trident I, and we did a very detailed study projecting 50 years into the future in 1980, looking at measurable quantities. So somebody wants to talk detail with me, I'm all ears. But until I hear detail other than hand waving and maybe it'll work, maybe it won't, you know, that's not a way to plan the national security of the country. Now, there is a technical potential for building a defense. It is a kind of boost phase defense. Mike said it's not possible. I don't know how he knows that because I've actually been studying it in great detail. And you could...
I did not say that.
Well, that's what I understood you to say.
I said there are 3 phases, and missile defense involves a layered defense against all phases of it.
I apologize for misquoting you.
There's extensive work going on in all 3 phases.
There are not. That's one of the problems. That's one of the things that I've been trying to do with, incidentally, Bill Perry, another hippie. And there are things you could do. There are things you could do that could allow you to build a defense of some capability. And there's no point in getting in here. I'd be happy to talk with you privately. I've done a lot of work on this, and we're talking to the Russians about it, and we're trying to talk to the administration, but they always seem to be too busy. I don't know what they're doing, but you know, it's really difficult.
Ted, they may not know what they're doing, but I know what I'm doing.
Yeah, okay,
and I know
I'm
that
finished.
these people have sat through almost 2 hours of discussion of a very complex, I think important subject. And I think they are entitled, at least the lucky ones that get their hand up quickly, to ask questions. But you have to give your affiliation, and you have to tell me to whom you were addressing your question. So, Harry?
Harry Chrysler from the Institute of International Studies. And I guess I would address it to all 3. How do you build, thank you, how do you build a political constituency to reverse direction, assuming we decided, you know, as a result of this discussion, to reverse direction? And how do you do that in the context where the inertia of what you're doing may be creating tensions with the parties you've identified as adversaries?
Thank you, Harry. I will leave it to whichever of you raises your hand to address that. Michael?
It's a policy question.
Well, by reversing direction, you mean generally, you mean like stopping the missile defense program?
Right.
What would you?
Yeah,
What,
or this or any program. In other words, yeah,
that's,
especially in national defense.
well, you have to mobilize support. You've got to have experts who can make a technical case that can ultimately lead to political support where it counts, which is on Capitol Hill, to deny budgetary support. That's ultimately how you do it. I mean, the Vietnam War got stopped ultimately because the Congress stopped funding it. And if the Congress funds it, it's going to continue. And that's how that's in general how you have to stop it.
I don't have an answer to your question, but I have a comment that I think could inform it. In 2008, we had a financial collapse that threatened to not only bring down our whole economy, but the rest of the world along with it. The reasons for it were really well understood by anybody who actually sat down and looked at the system, although all the people who had responsibilities claimed they didn't see it coming. Right now, the banks, which are too big to fail before, are even bigger. Credit default swaps are still being traded. Wild gambling is still going on. Glass-Steagall has not been put back in place. And let me tell you, we're going to have another collapse. Now, getting to missile defense. if such a threat to the country as the whole economy is not being addressed by the political leadership, why do you think they're going to address missile defense?
Dean, do you want to comment, or should I take another question?
I would agree with what Michael said. You know, it's developing a constituency. There are vested interests, of course. You know, Congress ultimately funds this stuff, so you've got to get to the Hill.
It's the way it works. It's like making sausages, I understand.
Yeah.
Are there other questions? Yes.
You asked for me to identify myself. My name is Jackie Cabasso. I'm the executive director of the Western States Legal Foundation in Oakland, which is a 30-year-old nuclear disarmament advocacy group. I have two just straightforward questions and a comment. The two questions are, none of you mentioned any radars or potential radars that are maybe stationed in Norway or Scandinavia. And I wonder if you have any information about that. Second, if anybody wants to comment on this, what they think is the significance of the fact that Anders Rasmussen, the Secretary General of NATO, has recently announced that it's likely that he will cancel the joint planned NATO-Russia summit on the margins of the NATO summit in Chicago because of the distance on the question of missile defense. The comment is, and this is not a sarcastic question, why on earth would Iran launch a nuclear weapon, if it had one, at Europe, knowing that it would be a completely suicidal mission? And second of all, I think it's wrong to call it missile defense, because in George Bush's nuclear posture review, when he unveiled the new strategic triad, it clearly linked offenses and defenses as swords and shields, and that new strategic triad was not called by the same name in the Obama nuclear posture review, but all the pieces are still there, and it's operating the same way.
Thank you very much. Again, you addressed it to all three, which doesn't make my job any easier. Do I have any volunteers? Dean, you look like you're ready.
Yeah, let me just pick up on the last point you made. It is true the likelihood of Iran ever launching a nuclear-tipped missile is very low. In my mind, the problem is there is tremendous coercive leverage Iran can gain by threatening to do that. They can split coalitions. They can dissuade countries from joining coalitions. They may even dissuade the U.S. from even entering the region if, let's say, there's some, well, let's take the Straits of Hormuz, for example, since that's in the news. If they closed off the Straits and the U.S. decided to go in, and they could threaten a nuclear attack against U.S. ally, or much less the U.S. homeland, which they can't now. That threat is a very potent threat. And in my mind, missile defense gives you a shield that you can rattle to neutralize the saber rattling of the offensive threat. And so missile defense serves a political strategic purpose without anything ever being launched. And that, in my mind, is a significant virtue. The chance that any state is going to attack the United States with a nuclear weapon is pretty small, although one can worry about accidental launch scenarios and things like that, which are not deterrable events. They're just events that are a disaster if they occur.
Actually, there's an important assumption in Dean's statement that, is in dispute here, which is that the defense has any real capability, and the adversary will be so stupid as to believe it does. So that's an issue that you need to decide about for yourself. I personally believe, this is going to sound brutal to you, that the way to make the United States safest from this kind of attack and its allies is to make it very clear that any country who attacks us in this way will look like a glass parking lot when we're finished with them. And we would prefer very much not to ever have to do this. But if they do it, we're not going to be ambiguous in our reaction at all. The last thing I want to do is to give somebody the idea that they might execute a nuclear attack on the United States or its friends and allies and get away without a response. And I think mussying up the arguments is really not in the interest of stability. Oh, and on the radar, in Norway. I could talk to you about it offline. I was disinvited from Norway after I showed that this radar was an intelligence gathering radar, and so.
There are radars in different places. Yeah. There are no missile defense radars that are currently planned for Norway. But
I'll respond briefly on the second and third of your questions or comments. On the Russian Rasmussen point, as I mentioned, the talks on missile defense cooperation have not borne fruit. It led the president of Russia to make a very tough statement. And I think until we get them back on track, it's not going to be discussed at a NATO summit. So there's also, of course, a presidential election in Russia, and there's a lot of electoral political issues in Russia that affect everything they say on all issues, as is true elsewhere. And on the third point, I agree completely with Dean's point. But you know, if you extrapolate your reason a little further, then what's the point if any of these countries have nuclear weapons? We should not be at all concerned. And that's just a foolish...
That's not what I said.
Well, you said, you know, why would they do it? Yeah, so if we don't care, if we think it's fruitless for them to consider using these weapons politically or militarily, then we should be agnostic or indifferent to their acquisition, which clearly you're not if you're in a disarmament a group.
That's completely twisting.
Yeah. No, well, I just think if you're in a position of real responsibility in government where you have to really make decisions and you're not carping from the outside, and you really have the weight of responsibility on your shoulders, part of the weight of the nation's security on your shoulders, then you're going to be more cautious than more cavalier about such threats, especially from a regime such as the regime that's in Tehran or in Pyongyang.
Speaking as a person who carped from the inside, one of the problems
How many years ago was that, Ted, by the way? You mentioned that many times. How many decades ago were you in the Pentagon?
20 years ago. In fact, more than 20 years ago.
Okay.
Do you have a technical point to make, or are you just going to appeal to authority again?
Gentlemen.
Well, I'm just
there's
a
only
little.
time. There's really
you know,
only.
I think I want to finish here. I think that it's astonishing that you were trained as an engineer and you have nothing technical to say, nothing at all. That's an interesting thing.
That's not my job in this.
Right.
In this context.
Just
that wasn't my job in the
Just
Pentagon.
to call people carpers.
Now, I had promised the Q&A.
I want to make a statement, please. I know
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
No,
But you don't want to be interrupted, is that right?
Ted.
Well, yeah, please interrupt me. Please, I'd love to have the exchange with you.
I think we're having
nuclear states get nuclear weapons
Aren't
because
we having it?
it looks like we are, and I think that's good. States get nuclear weapons because they want to protect themselves. That's a big motivation. China,
It's not
for
the
example,
sole motivation.
it's not the sole motivation. That's true, and they want to coerce other states. That's true too. We can go through it in hundreds of levels if we're a political scientist. But the reality is
Or
that
a responsible
states,
government official.
or an irresponsible government official pushing lines that other people state for them.
Dean,
I don't
why are
hear
you so
any
shy?
deviation. I don't hear any deviation from any spokesperson from the government. You're not even willing to make a clear statement that the GMD system will work as a defense. Something when you were part of a report that made that claim, and I can show with slides. I can show with slides I have here that the last two experiments were attempts to rig the experiment. So the administration had to know about those experiments.
Now,
states try to get nuclear weapons because they want to keep us off their backs. And if you talk, for example, after the Gulf War of '91, there was a prominent Indian general. I remember everyone was talking about him because he said what he learned from the Gulf War of '91 was, if you want to keep the United States off your back, have a nuclear weapon. And the North Koreans have learned that too. So why shouldn't the Iranians?
They may well have. I have to apologize, but there's really only time for one more question. And it better be a good one, and it better be brief. And it better be addressed to one of the panelists. Do I have any takers? Raymond. Professor Jean Lowe, Professor of Physics.
Raymond John Law. I'm here at UC Berkeley, and actually I'll try and change the nature of this discussion a little bit by making a comment rather than posing a question. And I just wanted to mention, as all three of our panelists know, that there is a report that's due to come out from the National Research Council on at least a part of this problem. I had the privilege of reviewing that report. I don't know when it will be out, but it's supposed to be imminent in the next weeks. And I thought, as an outside reviewer, that it does a very good job of going into considerable detail of what I think anyone from the outside has to admit is rather an arcane, sophisticated, complicated topic. As complicated technically, but also in non-technical, but equally important matters of concepts of operations and deployments and many other factors. That report does not go into the greater political issues, the economics and so on so much, but I really do commend this to you when it comes out. I believe it'll be freely available as a PDF to the public. And I just thought, since at least one of our panelists was a co-author of this report, perhaps they're a little bit shy about mentioning. A lot of work went into it. A very large expert group was put together. And I happen to think that it will contribute to the discussion by clarifying a lot of the concepts and issues without necessarily resolving the issues to the satisfaction of anyone, let alone everyone in this room.
Raymond,
It's a report that's coming out from the National Academy of Sciences or National Research Council on ballistic missile defense, and I believe it's still being vetted in final reviews right now.
No, I was excluded from this list.
Raymond, I want to thank you for a very fine comment, which breaks my usual ground rules that all Q&A have to start with questions. I appreciate the comment. This is a highly complex subject, politically, technically, sociologically, international politics, national politics. I think we were very fortunate in having three people willing to inform us and discuss matters between them on an issue that I'm fairly certain will be front and center of the American political situations for the next decade. And at least I think we got to a good start today in trying to understand what these issues are and will be. The fact that the three panelists didn't agree should surprise no one at all. With that, though, I want to thank the three of you for a very, very fine job. And I want to... I'm sorry. And I want to thank you all. That was the way you avoided all those flashes of brilliance. Escapes me, but I thank you very much for coming.
If it wasn't important, it wouldn't be worth fighting about.
Don. I'm sorry, don't even think about it. Here's the phone? No. Each day is short.
Dean, thank you.
All right.
Thank you. Better or worse than
Yeah,
is it better or worse than the usual post